I never thought planting a few tomatoes and bell peppers could turn into a full-blown war. But that was before Karen, the new HOA president, decided she ran our entire neighborhood like some kind of dictator. It started on a quiet Sunday morning. I walked outside, feeling proud of the small garden my dad and I had planted in our front yard. The green leaves glistened under the sunlight, the first signs of tiny vegetables beginning to sprout. Mom had always wanted a garden, and with Dad's busy schedule at the bank, it was the one thing that brought our family together every weekend. But that morning, something felt off. A bright pink slip was taped to our front door. My stomach twisted as I pulled it off and read the bold black letters. Violation. Notice, unauthorized landscaping. Fine, $200. What? My voice shot up in disbelief. How was this unauthorized? It was just a garden. I rushed inside, waving the paper at Dad, who was sipping his morning coffee. He frowned, adjusting his glasses as he read it. Unauthorized landscaping, he muttered. That's ridiculous. There's nothing in the HOA rules about gardens. Mom walked in, still in her robe, taking the paper from him. We've had that garden for months. No one's ever complained. That's when we heard it. A sharp knock at the door. Dad opened it to reveal Karen Matthews, standing there with her signature fake smile and clipboard in hand. She wore her usual expensive workout clothes, even though I was sure she had never exercised a day in her life. Her eyes flicked to the pink slip in my dad's hand, and her smirk widened. "Oh, I see you got the notice," she said sweetly. "HOA regulations are very clear. Front yard landscaping must be approved, and your little farm is an eyesore." I clenched my fists. It's not a farm, it's a small garden. Karen's expression didn't change. Rules are rules. Remove it by the end of the week or the fines will double. Dad took a slow breath, keeping his voice calm. "Karen, this is absurd. There's nothing in the HOA guidelines about gardens." "Oh, but there is." She flipped open her clipboard, revealing a printed document with Section 8.4, approved landscaping features highlighted. I felt the blood drain from my face. That rule hadn't been there before. Dad scanned the paper, his jaw tightening. "This was added recently." Karen shrugged. "The HOA board voted on it last month. You should really read the updates we send out." Mom crossed her arms. "This is personal, isn't it?" Karen's smile never faltered. "I simply uphold the rules. If I made exceptions for you, then everyone would want to plant whatever they pleased. Imagine the mess. Pinecrest Estates is a prestigious neighborhood. We can't have people treating it like a community garden." Dad's fingers curled around the pink slip. His expression remained unreadable, but I knew that look. He wasn't going to let this slide. Karen tapped her clipboard. "I'll be expecting compliance. Have a great day." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving our family standing in stunned silence. The moment she was gone, Mom slammed the door shut. That woman is out of control. Dad exhaled slowly, staring at the fine in his hand. "She thinks she's untouchable," he murmured. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. I knew that look too. He wasn't just going to pay the fine, he was going to fight back. That night at dinner, the mood at our table was tense. Mom angrily stabbed her salad, muttering about Karen under her breath. Dad was quiet, too quiet, which meant his mind was working through something. And me? I just kept replaying the moment Karen had smirked at us on our own doorstep, acting like she owned everything. "She planned this," Mom said, shaking her head. "She had that rule changed just so she could fine us, and you saw how smug she was." Dad took a slow sip of his water before setting his glass down. "She's enjoying her power a little too much." She's a control freak, I muttered. Mom sighed. What do we do, just pay the fine? Dad finally spoke. Number. We're not removing the garden, and I'm not giving Karen a single dollar. My eyes widened. But the fine doubles if we don't pay. Dad leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. That's what she wants. She's counting on us giving in. But I want to see just how far she's willing to go. That sent a chill down my spine. Mom didn't look convinced. Tom, this is Karen we're talking about. If we don't pay, she'll keep finding us for other things. She's targeting us now. She's already doing that, Dad said simply. Might as well give her a real reason to be mad. I grinned. I liked this side of Dad. Mom sighed, rubbing her temples. Fine. But if we're going to fight this, I need to know what's in those HOA rules, and I mean all of them. Dad nodded. Good idea. I'll pull up the HOA documents tonight. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see Karen peeking through the blinds of her house across the street. But she wasn't there. Not yet. The next morning, the real trouble began. I woke up to the sound of a loud thud against our house. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it happened again. I jumped out of bed and ran to my window, my stomach dropping at what I saw. A group of HOA workers were ripping out our garden. No way, I whispered, my pulse skyrocketing. I sprinted downstairs, barely registering Mom's shocked gasp as she saw the destruction outside. Dad was already ahead of us, throwing open the front door. Hey, he shouted, storming down the steps. What do you think you're doing? The workers barely spared him a glance as they yanked out the plants we had spent months growing. Sir, one of them said, straightening up, we're under HOA orders to remove unauthorized landscaping. Dad's face turned red. Who gave that order? Karen Matthews, the worker said, pointing across the street. And there she was, standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching us with a victorious smirk. I felt rage bubble inside me. This wasn't just about a garden. She wanted to break us. Mom grabbed Dad's arm, holding him back. Tom, think. Dad exhaled sharply before pulling out his phone. Fine. If they won't stop, I'm calling the police. Karen's expression flickered just for a second. Then she laughed. Go ahead, she called out. We're following HOA guidelines. You signed an agreement when you moved here. Dad's fingers hovered over his phone, but before he could dial, a new voice cut through the air. This is insane. We all turned to see Mr. Jackson, our next-door neighbor, stepping onto his porch, shaking his head. Since when does the HOA have the right to destroy people's property? Another voice chimed in. Yeah, this is messed up. It was Mrs. Garcia from 3 houses down. Within minutes, more neighbors had stepped outside, watching the chaos unfold. Karen didn't expect this, but she recovered quickly. She turned to them, her voice all sugar and fake authority. It's standard procedure, Mr. Jackson. We're just ensuring that property values stay high. Jackson crossed his arms. Really? Because my wife and I were just fined for having a porch swing that didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. And I heard the Smiths got a violation for their mailbox being half an inch too tall. A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Karen's expression hardened. These rules exist for a reason. I stepped forward, my voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Or maybe you're just making them up as you go. That hit a nerve. Karen's jaw clenched, but she quickly masked it with a smile. If you have concerns, you're welcome to bring them up at the next HOA meeting. Dad finally pocketed his phone, his gaze locked onto hers. Oh, don't worry, I will. Karen's smug expression faltered. But the damage was done. Our garden was completely gone. The workers packed up and left as if they hadn't just destroyed months of our hard work. Mom squeezed Dad's hand, anger flickering in her eyes. "Tom," she said quietly, "we need to hit her where it hurts." Dad nodded. "We will." That night, as he sat at his laptop, I peeked over his shoulder. He had the HOA financial records pulled up. I frowned. "What are you looking for?" Dad's lips curled into a smirk. "A weakness." That night, I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's smirking face, standing there with her arms crossed while our garden was destroyed. The image made my blood boil. She didn't just want us to follow the rules. She wanted to humiliate us, to prove she was in charge. I wasn't the only one who felt that way. When I walked downstairs, I saw Dad sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open, pages of HOA financial records spread out in front of him. He hadn't gone to bed at all. "Did you find something?" I asked, pulling up a chair beside him. Dad didn't look away from the screen. His eyes flickered with something I recognized: determination. "Oh, I found a lot," he said. Mom walked in, still in her robe, rubbing her eyes. "You're still up?" Dad finally leaned back, stretching his arms. "You're going to love this. Our wonderful HOA has been collecting tens of thousands of dollars in fines every month." Mom frowned. "That's not surprising. Karen fines people for breathing too loudly." Dad shook his head. "That's not the problem. The problem is that the money is missing." I blinked. "What do you mean, missing?" Dad turned his laptop screen so we could see. He had two documents side by side. One was the HOA's official financial statement, and the other was a report from a third-party accounting firm that homeowners had access to. "These numbers should match," Dad said, pointing to the totals. "But they don't. The HOA claims they used over $100,000 in fines for neighborhood maintenance. But there's no record of where the money actually went." Mom leaned in. "So, Karen's stealing?" Dad exhaled. "I can't prove that yet. But if she's moving money around, she's covering something up." I smirked. "And if anyone knows how to expose financial fraud, it's you." Dad smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Exactly." That morning, things got worse. I was pouring myself a bowl of cereal when I heard Mom gasp. I turned just in time to see her looking out the window, her eyes wide with anger. "Unbelievable," she muttered. I rushed to her side, and my stomach dropped. A bright red HOA notice was plastered on our front door. Final warning: failure to remove unauthorized landscaping. Fine $500. I threw open the door and ripped the paper off. "This is insane. They already tore it down." As if on cue, Karen appeared. She was standing across the street sipping her morning coffee like she hadn't just sent this ridiculous fine our way. Dad stepped outside, his voice calm but deadly. "Karen, we don't have a garden anymore." Karen smiled. "Yes, but you failed to remove the remaining soil and garden fencing in a timely manner." I clenched my fists. "You're making this up." Karen tilted her head. "It's all in the HOA guidelines. If you don't pay, we'll escalate this to legal action." Dad let out a slow breath, nodding. "Good, I hope you do." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" Dad smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind that made me nervous. "I'm actually looking forward to taking this to court," he said, crossing his arms. "Because once a judge looks at the HOA's finances, I'd love to hear you explain why over $100,000 in fines has disappeared." Karen's face paled. For the first time, she looked nervous. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Dad pulled out his phone. Oh, I think you do, and I'll be happy to explain it at the next HOA meeting. Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed back into her house. Mom smirked. I think you just scared her. Dad exhaled. Good, but this isn't over. She's going to come at us even harder now. I swallowed. So, what do we do? Dad's jaw tightened. We bring in the neighbors. That night, we held a secret meeting. Mr. Jackson offered up his garage, and by 8 p.m., over 20 families had crammed inside. Some people brought folding chairs, others leaned against the walls, but everyone was angry. This has to stop, Mrs. Garcia said. We got fined $300 for having non-uniform porch lights. What does that even mean? The HOA forced me to repaint my shutters, Mr. Patel added. They were beige. They said it had to be approved beige. Mr. Jackson shook his head. Karen's out of control. She's making up rules just to make money. Dad held up his laptop. And that's exactly the problem. I've looked at the HOA's finances. The fines we've all been paying? They aren't going where they should be. Murmurs spread through the group. Mr. Jackson frowned. Wait, are you saying the HOA is stealing from us? Dad nodded. I can't say for sure where the money is going, but I can say that it's not being used for neighborhood maintenance like they claim. A few people gasped. Others cursed under their breath. Then Mrs. Wilson, the sweet old lady from down the street, stood up. Her voice trembled. They fined me for my bird feeder. Mr. Jackson frowned. That's ridiculous. You've had that bird feeder for years. She nodded, eyes welling up. Karen said it attracts pests. I told her the birds were my only company most days. She didn't care. She told me to take it down or pay $150. Silence fell over the room. That was it, the final straw. Mr. Jackson slammed his fist against the garage wall. That's it. I don't care what it takes. We're taking her down. Dad nodded. Good, because I have a plan. I leaned forward. What is it? Dad's smile returned. We're going to overthrow Karen. The room erupted in whispers. Mom raised an eyebrow. How exactly do we do that? Dad turned his laptop to face the group. According to the HOA bylaws, if we get enough signatures, we can force an emergency election. And if Karen is caught mishandling funds, she can be removed from the board permanently. A slow smile spread across Mr. Jackson's face. Mrs. Garcia cracked her knuckles. Where do I sign? Dad grinned. Let's get to work. As we filed out of the garage, I glanced across the street. Karen was standing at her window, watching us. She knew something was coming, but she had no idea what we had planned. The next morning, the plan was set in motion. We started small. Casual conversations at mailboxes, quiet whispers at the local grocery store, and accidental encounters while walking the dog. The message spread like wildfire. We were gathering signatures to remove Karen. By the afternoon, we already had 25 names. We needed 70% of the neighborhood to force an emergency vote, but word was getting around. Fast. And Karen, she knew something was up. I caught her watching me from her window twice, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. By lunchtime, the retaliation began. I was coming home from school when I saw it. A bright pink slip taped to our mailbox. Violation. Trash cans left in view. Fine, $100. My blood boiled. Our trash cans weren't even out. I stormed inside, shoving the notice in front of Dad. She's panicking, he said, barely glancing at it. This means we're getting to her. Mom wasn't as calm. That's the third fake violation this week. What's next? A fine for breathing? Almost as if she had heard her, the doorbell rang. I opened it and immediately regretted it. Karen stood on our porch, arms crossed, her clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. "Thomas," she said, smiling in that fake, condescending way, "we need to talk." Dad stepped forward, folding his arms. "Do we?" Karen tapped her pen against her clipboard. "I've been hearing some troubling rumors." Dad raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" She smiled wider. "That certain families, your family, are trying to stir up dissent against the HOA. "Dissent?" Dad repeated, pretending to be confused. "I'm just reviewing the financial records. You know, like any responsible homeowner would." Karen's smile flickered. "I would hate," she continued, her voice lowering, "for your little rebellion to cost your family." I tensed. "Are you threatening us?" Karen gasped dramatically. "Oh, of course not. I'm just saying. Violations add up, fines get expensive, and if they're unpaid, well, that leads to foreclosure." Dad's expression didn't change, but I could see the way his fists clenched. Karen stepped back, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "Just something to think about." And then she walked away. Mom slammed the door shut. "I hate that woman." Dad took a deep breath. "She just made a mistake." I frowned. "How?" He turned to us, his eyes gleaming. "She's scared." That night, things took a dark turn. It was nearly midnight when I woke up to the sound of a car door slamming outside. I sat up, my heart pounding. Slowly, I crept to my window and peered through the blinds. My stomach dropped. A shadowy figure was moving across our front yard. I held my breath. The motion sensor light flipped on, revealing Karen. She was holding something. A spray can. Before I could even process what was happening, she turned and sprayed a streak of bright red paint across our garage door. I gasped. She took a step back, admiring her work. Then, as quickly as she had come, she ran back to her car and sped off down the street. I bolted out of my room. "Dad! Mom!" Within minutes, we were outside, staring at the graffiti across our garage. Liars. Mom covered her mouth in shock. She actually... Dad's face was unreadable. "Get my phone." I ran inside and grabbed it, my hands shaking as I pulled up the security app. Dad clicked on the footage from our doorbell camera. And there she was. Clear as day, Karen vandalizing our house. A slow, satisfied smile spread across Dad's face. "We've got her," Mom exhaled. "We're calling the cops." Dad shook his head. "Not yet." I blinked. "What? She literally broke the law." Dad tapped his fingers on the phone, thinking. "We could report her now. She'd get arrested for vandalism, but she'd just post bail and play the victim." Mom crossed her arms. "So, what's your plan?" Dad smiled. "We let her think she got away with it for now." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what Dad was planning. But I knew one thing. Karen had finally messed with the wrong family. The next day, Dad went to work as usual, but I knew he wasn't just doing his job. By the time he came home, his expression was unreadable. "What happened?" I asked. Dad set his briefcase on the counter. "Let's just say I had an interesting meeting." Mom frowned. "With who?" Dad exhaled. "First National Bank. The HOA submitted a loan application a few weeks ago." My eyes widened. "Wait, the HOA is borrowing money?" Dad nodded. "A lot of money, over $1 million. Mom's jaw dropped. "For what?" Dad smirked. "Karen claims it's for neighborhood improvements, but their financial records don't add up." I swallowed. "So, what does that mean?" Dad's eyes gleamed. "It means I froze their loan application." I gasped. "You what?" "You can do that?" Dad chuckled. "As the senior loan officer, absolutely." Mom stared at him. "Tom, she's going to lose it." Dad's expression darkened. "Let her. She thinks she's untouchable. She isn't." By that evening, the news had spread. Mr. Jackson called first. "Tom, what the hell did you do? Karen's in a panic." Then Mrs. Garcia. "She just called an emergency HOA meeting. She's losing it." By nightfall, half the neighborhood knew something was going on. And then, Karen showed up at our house. The doorbell rang. Dad opened it calmly, as if he'd been expecting her. Karen was furious. "You had no right to interfere with HOA business." Dad tilted his head. "I had every right. You applied for a loan using our community's funds as collateral. That makes it our business." Karen was shaking. "You need to approve that loan. Now." Dad smiled. "Or what? You'll fine us again?" Karen's nostrils flared. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Dad didn't blink. "Neither do you." Then he pulled out his phone and played the security footage. Karen's face drained of color as she watched herself spray painting our garage. Her breathing turned shallow. Dad tucked his phone away. "This is evidence. Vandalism, property damage, criminal mischief." He took a step closer. "And if you don't resign from the HOA board immediately, I'll be sending this video to the police." Karen staggered backward. You can't do this." Dad smirked. "Oh, Karen, I already did." And just like that, the game had changed. Karen didn't say a word. She just stood there, her face pale as she stared at the phone screen. She was trapped. For a moment, I thought she'd give up right then and there. I thought she'd finally realize she had lost. But Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Her eyes darkened, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. Then she did something I never expected. She laughed. A slow, mocking laugh that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Dad narrowed his eyes. "Something funny?" Karen smirked. "Oh, Tom, you really think you've won?" Dad didn't answer. Karen took a step forward, lowering her voice. "You're forgetting something," she whispered. "I still control this neighborhood." And before Dad could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away. I swallowed. That didn't feel like a victory. Dad's expression was unreadable. "No," he said slowly. It felt like a warning. The next morning, the real nightmare began. It started with a loud knock at the door. Mom opened it, and standing there was a man in a suit, holding a folder. "Thomas Reynolds?" he asked. Dad walked up beside Mom. "That's me." The man handed him the folder. "You've been served." My stomach dropped. Mom gasped. "What?" Dad opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page, his jaw tightened. "It's a lawsuit," he muttered. "Karen is suing us for harassment and defamation." My mouth fell open. "You're kidding." Dad clenched his teeth. "She's claiming that we've been spreading false information about her and damaging her reputation." Mom snatched the papers, her eyes scanning them. "She's demanding you be removed from the HOA." I felt my blood boil. "She vandalized our house. We have proof. How can she sue us?" Dad let out a long breath. "Because she's desperate. She's trying to intimidate us." Mom shook her head. "We need a lawyer." Dad sighed. "Good thing I know a few." That night, while Dad was on the phone with legal contacts, things escalated even further. Mom and I were watching TV when the power suddenly cut out. Everything went dark. I sat up straight. Then, through the window, I saw them. 2 men in black hoodies standing near our power box. "Mom," I whispered, pointing. Mom's face paled. "Oh my God!" She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Dad. "Tom, get home now." Within minutes, Dad's car came screeching into the driveway. The moment the headlights hit them, the 2 men ran. Dad jumped out of the car, but they had already disappeared into the night. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Mom's hands were trembling. They cut our power. I saw them." Dad turned to me. "Did you see their faces?" I swallowed. Number. But it wasn't random. Someone sent them. We all knew who. Karen. She was taking things to the next level. Dad took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Who are you calling?" Mom asked. Dad's voice was calm, too calm. "The bank." I frowned. "Why?" Dad's jaw tightened. "Because if Karen wants a war, she's about to get one." The next morning, chaos erupted. Karen had no idea what Dad had done the night before, but she found out fast. At exactly 9 a.m., the HOA board members received a formal letter from the bank. I watched from our window as Karen stormed out of her house, waving the letter in the air like a lunatic. She was screaming into her phone, pacing up and down the sidewalk. Mom smirked. I wonder what she just found out. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking completely relaxed. Probably that the bank has launched a full-scale audit on the HOA's finances. I nearly choked on my cereal. "Wait, what? You can do that?" Dad shrugged. "When a loan is flagged for financial discrepancies, the bank has the legal right to investigate. And Karen's $1 million loan just got put on hold." Mom's eyes widened. "So they're going to dig through everything?" Dad nodded. "Every single dollar," I grinned. "So if she's been stealing, they'll find it," Dad finished, and Karen knew it. That's why, a few minutes later, she showed up at our house again. This time, she didn't knock, she banged. Dad took his sweet time opening the door. Karen was fuming. "You did this!" she shrieked, shoving the letter in his face. Dad barely glanced at it. "Did what?" Karen's face turned red. "You told the bank to freeze our loan." Dad smiled. "Actually, no, I didn't have to. Your financial records raised some serious red flags." He folded his arms. "You really should be more careful." Karen's lips trembled. You're ruining everything." Dad tilted his head. "No, Karen, you did that yourself." For the first time since this all started, Karen looked scared. Really scared. She stepped back, shaking her head. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Dad raised an eyebrow. "Neither do you." And with that, he shut the door in her face. That night, we expected her to try something. We were ready. We set up extra security cameras. Dad had a lawyer on standby. We weren't going to let Karen intimidate us anymore, but Karen didn't come back. In fact, she disappeared. The next day, she didn't leave her house. No morning walk, no clipboard in hand. By the third day, her car hadn't moved from the driveway, and then, on the fourth day, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. Mom gasped. "Number, way." I ran to the window. We all watched as movers started carrying out furniture. Then, finally, Karen stepped outside. She looked different. Her usual perfect posture was gone, her shoulders slumped. She looked defeated. And standing at the end of her driveway were two men in suits. Dad exhaled. "HOA investigators." I grinned. "So she's finally done?" Dad's lips curled into a smirk. "Looks like it." Karen didn't say goodbye. She didn't even look at us. She just got into her car and drove away. Just like that, the reign of terror was over. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because what we found out next was even worse than we imagined. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more Karen patrolling the streets. No more ridiculous fines. No more pink violation slips plastered on doors like unwanted decorations. Karen was gone. Or at least, that's what we thought. Because the next morning, something strange happened. At exactly 6 a.m., a mysterious black SUV pulled into Karen's empty driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as two men in suits stepped out. Dad?" I called. He walked over, still holding his coffee. The moment he saw the SUV, he froze. Mom frowned. "Who were they?" Dad's face darkened. "I don't know, but they're not with the HOA." The men didn't knock. They had a key. Within seconds, they unlocked the front door and walked inside. Something about it felt off. I swallowed. "Should we call someone?" Dad didn't answer right away. He was watching the house closely, like he was putting pieces together in his head. Then, after a long moment, he muttered, "Let's wait." An hour passed, then 2. The men never came out. And then, just as suddenly as they arrived, they reappeared, carrying boxes. I watched as they loaded everything into the SUV. "What the hell is going on?" Mom whispered. Dad exhaled. "They're taking files." My stomach dropped. "Files?" Dad nodded. "Those are bankers' boxes. I recognize them. They're full of documents." Mom's face paled. Karen was hiding something. Dad's jaw tightened. Something big. I felt my pulse quicken. "Do you think it's about the missing HOA money?" Dad shook his head. "It's more than that." The SUV door slammed shut. The men didn't look around, didn't hesitate. They just got in and drove away. And just like that, Karen's house was completely empty. That should have been the end of it. It should have been over. But that night, at exactly midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. A single knock, not on the door, on my bedroom window. I sat up, my heart hammering. The room was dark. The only light came from the street lamp outside. Slowly, I turned my head, and there she was, Karen, standing outside my window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't smirking. She looked desperate. Her eyes were wild, her hair messy. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, she pressed a finger to her lips. Shh. Then she held something against the glass. A USB drive. My mind raced. What the hell was happening? Before I could move, she dropped it on the windowsill and ran. I scrambled out of bed, rushing to the window, but by the time I got there, she was gone. Nothing left but the USB stick. My hands shook as I picked it up. What the hell had Karen just given me, and more importantly, why was she running? The next morning, I showed Dad the USB. He stared at it for a long moment, then sighed. "I don't like this," he muttered. Mom frowned. "What's on it?" Dad grabbed his laptop and plugged it in. A single folder popped up, labeled Insurance. I shivered. Insurance for what? Dad double-clicked it, and that's when we saw them. Hundreds of documents, financial statements, memos, transactions, names, dates. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. I didn't understand at first. But then Dad clicked on a file labeled HOAPAYMENTS, and suddenly it all made sense. Because Karen hadn't just been stealing money. She had been paying someone off. And the names on the payments, they weren't random. They were government officials. I felt my stomach turn. This is bigger than just our neighborhood. Dad's face was grim, much bigger. He clicked on another document. And that's when we saw the biggest bombshell of all. It was an email from Karen, sent 2 days ago. Subject, urgent, they know. Message, the audit is going deeper than expected. If this gets out, we're all screwed. I need more time. If I disappear, you know what to do. My blood ran cold. Mom's voice barely came out. Disappear? I swallowed. You don't think... Dad clenched his jaw. We need to call someone, now. I thought Karen was the villain. I thought we had won. But now I wasn't so sure. because Karen wasn't just running from us. She was running from someone else, and whoever they were coming. Dad immediately grabbed his phone. "We're calling the police," Mom said, her voice shaky. But Dad didn't dial 911. He hesitated. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts and called someone else. "Who are you calling?" I asked, my heart still pounding from what we had just read. Dad put the phone on speaker. A deep voice answered. "Tom?" "Hey, Matt," Dad said, his voice lower than usual. "I need to ask you something." Hypothetically, I blinked. Who was Matt? Matt sighed. Hypothetically, Dad exhaled. "If someone were embezzling HOA funds and paying off city officials, who do you call?" There was silence. Then Matt's voice came through, sharper this time. "Tom, where did you hear that?" Dad glanced at me and Mom. "Let's just say, I have evidence." Another pause. Then Matt's voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you being watched?" I swallowed hard. What kind of question was that? Dad's face didn't change. "Not yet." "Good," Matt muttered. "Then listen carefully. Don't go to the police, not yet." Mom's eyes widened. "What?" Matt's voice turned urgent. "If city officials are involved, they might have cops on their payroll. If you turn this over to the wrong person, the evidence will disappear. And so will you." A chill ran down my spine. Dad clenched his jaw. "So what do we do?" Matt hesitated, then, "Meet me." "Tonight. I'll explain everything." Dad nodded. "Where?" Matt gave him an address, then the line went dead. Mom shook her head. "Tom, who is that?" Dad exhaled. "An old friend." I frowned. "Old friend? From where?" Dad looked at me, his face unreadable. "From another life." That night, we drove to the meeting spot. It wasn't a restaurant, it wasn't an office, it was a parking garage. The whole drive there, my stomach was in knots. The USB was still in my pocket, and every time I touched it, my fingers tingled like I was holding a live grenade. Dad pulled into an empty spot. The garage was deserted. Until suddenly, headlights flashed. A black car pulled up in front of us. A man stepped out, tall, broad shoulders, dressed in all black. Dad got out of the car. I started to follow, but Mom grabbed my arm. "Stay here." I clenched my jaw but obeyed. Through the windshield, I watched them talk. The man, Matt, spoke in hushed tones, gesturing toward Dad's laptop. Dad handed him a copy of the USB drive. Matt plugged it into a tablet. His face was blank as he scrolled through the files. Then, his entire expression changed. He stiffened, looked over his shoulder, then back at Dad. And for the first time, he looked afraid. He muttered something, shaking his head. Then he handed the laptop back, gripping Dad's shoulder tightly. Dad nodded, then turned, and walked back toward the car. I leaned forward as he got in. "What happened?" I asked. Dad's face was pale. "We're in trouble." The moment we got home, Dad locked the doors. Mom was shaking. "Tom, tell me what's going on." Dad took a deep breath. "The people Karen was paying off? It's worse than we thought." I swallowed. "How worse?" Dad looked at me. "These aren't just dirty politicians. Some of these names, they're criminals. People who handle money laundering, fraud, even worse." Mom put a hand over her mouth. "Karen was working with organized crime?" Dad nodded grimly. I felt my stomach drop. "But why?" Dad exhaled. "That's what I don't know yet. But Matt said we need to be careful. If Karen disappeared, she might have been running from them." I shivered. Then my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, expecting a spam message. But my breath caught in my throat. "Unknown number. You shouldn't have looked." I nearly dropped my phone. Dad saw my expression. "What?" I showed him the message. His face turned stone cold. Then the lights flickered. A car pulled up outside. I ran to the window. A black SUV sat at the curb, engine running, but no one got out. Dad grabbed his phone. "We're leaving, now." Mom's voice shook. "Where?" Dad's jaw tightened. "To find Karen." We packed fast. Dad barely explained anything. He just grabbed the laptop, the USB, and told us to move. I had never seen him like this before. Calm, but deadly serious. Within minutes, we were in the car. Dad pulled out of the driveway, keeping his eyes on the SUV behind us. It didn't move, not at first. Then, as we turned the corner, its headlights flicked on, and it started following us. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Dad." "I see it," he muttered. Mom's hands were white-knuckled on her seatbelt. "What do we do?" Dad's voice was cold. "We lose them." Then he slammed his foot on the gas. The car roared forward. The SUV sped up behind us. I gripped my seat. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted to stop us, and they weren't going to let us go without a fight. Dad's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the SUV closed in behind us. We were speeding down a dark, empty road, the headlights of our pursuers glaring in the rearview mirror. Mom clutched the dashboard. "Tom." "I know," Dad muttered. I twisted in my seat, my pulse racing. The SUV was gaining. Whoever was inside wasn't just following us. They were hunting us. The car lurched forward as Dad floored the gas, taking a sharp turn onto a side street. The SUV followed. My stomach churned. "They're not giving up." Dad gritted his teeth. "Then I won't either." Another turn, then another. We were weaving through the streets, but the SUV stayed right on our tail. Mom's voice was tight. "Tom, we can't outrun them forever." Dad didn't respond. Instead, he made a sharp right into an alley. The SUV followed, but Dad didn't stop. He suddenly slammed the brakes. The SUV had no time to react. It skidded forward, trying to stop, and crashed straight into a dumpster. The impact rattled our car as we watched the SUV's hood crumple. Dad threw the car into reverse, backing out of the alley in a matter of seconds. Then, with a final glance at the wrecked SUV, he sped off into the night. I twisted in my seat, my heart still hammering. Did that work?" Dad exhaled. "For now." Mom was still breathing hard. "Tom, where are we going?" Dad's hands were tight on the wheel. "To the last place anyone would expect." 30 minutes later, we pulled up to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow over the parking lot. Mom frowned. "Why here?" Dad killed the engine. "Because if someone's looking for us, they won't expect us to be at a place like this." I swallowed. "So, what now?" Dad's jaw tightened. "Now, we find Karen." Mom's face hardened. "How? She's gone." Dad reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Not completely." I leaned closer. On the screen was a call log. Dad tapped the most recent outgoing call. And then I saw the name, Karen Matthews. I nearly choked. "Wait, you have her number?" Dad's voice was unreadable. "I do now." Before I could ask more, Dad pressed CALL. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a click. And then a voice. Breathless. Shaky. "Tom?" My stomach dropped. Karen sounded terrified. Dad's expression darkened. "Karen, we need to meet." "No." Her voice was frantic. I can't be seen with you." Dad's tone remained calm. "We have the files." Silence. Then a whisper. "You weren't supposed to see those." Mom and I exchanged a look. Dad pressed on. "We need answers. Where are you?" Karen hesitated. Then, in the background, we heard it. A car door, footsteps, then a male voice. "Karen, get off the phone." Karen inhaled sharply. I have to go. Karen. The line went dead. I shivered. Dad, who was that? Dad didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the phone screen. Then he muttered, "She's not running from us. She's running from them." The next morning, we got our answer. I was scrolling through my phone in the motel room when something made me freeze. A news alert. I sat up straight. "Guys?" Mom turned. "What is it?" I read the headline out loud. Local HOA President Karen Matthews involved in financial scandal, currently missing. My blood ran cold. Mom rushed over. "Let me see that." I handed her the phone. The article was everywhere. Anonymous documents had been leaked to the press, exposing the corruption inside our HOA, the fines, the missing money, the bribes, and Karen had vanished. Dad exhaled. "Someone leaked the files." Mom looked at him. "It wasn't you." Dad shook his head. And if it wasn't me, then it had to be Karen." I felt my pulse quicken. "So she turned on them?" Dad's jaw tightened. "Looks like it." Mom let out a breath. "So what now?" Dad exhaled. "Now we wait. Whoever's behind this, they're going to start hunting." I shivered. "Hunting? Who?" Dad looked at me. "Anyone who knows too much." That night, the nightmare got worse. We were lying low in the motel. The air was thick with tension. No one spoke much, but then a car pulled into the parking lot. Dad was up in an instant, peeking through the blinds. My stomach twisted. "Who is it?" Dad didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone. Mom's voice dropped to a whisper. "Tom, what's going on?" Dad's face was unreadable. "We're not alone." I swallowed. "Is it them?" Dad's voice was calm, too calm. "I don't know yet." Then the motel room phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Mom's face drained of color. "Don't answer it." But Dad already had. He lifted the receiver to his ear, then his expression changed. First confusion, then something else. Shock. Slowly, he lowered the phone. I sat forward. "Dad?" He swallowed, then looked at me, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. That was Karen. My breath caught. "What did she say?" Dad exhaled, his grip tightening around the receiver. "She said they found her." A cold chill filled the room, and then a single sound echoed through the phone. A distant knock, a sharp intake of breath, then a click, and the line went dead. For a long moment, we all just sat there. The dial tone echoed through the motel room, filling the silence like a warning. Karen was gone, and whoever had found her might be coming for us next. Dad slowly set the phone back onto the receiver. His hands were steady, but I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. Mom swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Dad's eyes flickered toward the window. "We leave." I tensed. "But where?" "They're watching us." Dad stood, already reaching for his bag. "That's why we don't go home. We go somewhere they wouldn't expect." I frowned. "Where?" Dad exhaled. "To the one person who might have more answers than we do." I exchanged a look with Mom. And then Dad said something I never expected. "We're going to find Diane." My stomach dropped. Diane Matthews, Karen's best friend, and the HOA's vice president. The next morning, a new lead. We had no choice but to keep moving. Dad had managed to shake our pursuers for now, but we all knew it was only a matter of time before they found us again. By midday, we arrived at Diane's house. She lived in an upscale neighborhood, not as strict as ours, but still the kind of place where people had alarm systems and motion-detecting lights. Dad parked the car a block away. "Stay here." Mom grabbed his arm. "Be careful." He nodded, then slipped out of the car and walked toward the house. I watched him knock. Seconds passed. Then a curtain shifted. Someone was watching. Then finally the door creaked open, and Diane's face appeared. She looked terrible. Her hair was messy, her eyes bloodshot like she hadn't slept in days. She barely even looked like the put-together woman who used to strut around with Karen. I saw her mouth something. Then, suddenly, she grabbed Dad's arm and yanked him inside. Mom gasped. "Tom, wait." I held up a hand. If she wanted to hurt him, she wouldn't have let him in. Mom's fists clenched. I don't trust her. Neither did I. But something told me Diane might be just as scared as we were. Inside Diane's house, the truth comes out. It was almost 20 minutes before Dad came back outside. When he did, his face was pale. Mom and I jumped out of the car. "What happened?" I asked. Dad exhaled, glancing over his shoulder. "Diane's packing. She's leaving town." My stomach twisted. "Why?" Dad looked me straight in the eye. "Because Karen is dead." The world stopped. Mom's face drained of color. "What?" Dad nodded. "She was found this morning. Official cause? A car accident." I swallowed. "But you don't believe that?" Dad's jaw clenched. "No." Because we all knew the truth. Karen wasn't running from the police. She was running from whoever she had been working for. And now, they had silenced her. Diane's warning. Before we could even process the news, Diane came running out of the house. She had a suitcase in one hand and her phone in the other. "You need to leave," she whispered. "Now." Dad stepped in front of her. "Diane, we need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she snapped. "Karen is dead. They're going to clean this up, and anyone left standing will be next." Mom swallowed. "Who is they?" Diane's eyes darted around. She wasn't just scared, she was paranoid. "I don't know," she admitted. "Karen never told me their names. But I know they own people, cops, bankers, judges. They've been using HOA accounts to launder money." I inhaled sharply. "Launder money?" Diane nodded frantically. "They funneled dirty money through fake HOA violations. They made us fine people for the dumbest things, just so they could make those payments disappear into a different account." Mom's face was pure shock. "So, the HOA was just a front?" "Yes," Diane whispered, "and Karen thought she was in control. But she wasn't." Dad's face darkened. "So, when she tried to back out, they killed her," Diane finished. Chills ran down my spine. Diane grabbed Dad's arm. "Tom, you have to listen to me." Her voice trembled. "They're going to come for you next." The final threat. Diane was already halfway to her car when Dad asked, "Where are you going?" She shook her head. "Somewhere far away. I don't care where. I just need to disappear." Then she paused. She turned back to us, her face dead serious. "Do yourselves a favor," she whispered. "Drop this." Dad didn't answer. Diane swallowed hard. "You have a family. Let it go before it's too late." Then she got into her car and sped off. We just stood there, watching her taillights fade into the distance. Mom finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Dad exhaled. "We keep moving." I felt my stomach tighten. "Where?" Dad turned to me, his eyes sharper than ever. "To the only person left who might still have answers." I swallowed. "And who's that?" Dad looked at me. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "The HOA treasurer." I blinked. "Wait, Bob Wilson?" Bob Wilson, the same HOA board member who had suddenly moved out weeks ago. The same one who left without a trace. Dad nodded. "He ran for a reason, and if we find him, we might finally learn who's really behind all of this." I felt my pulse quicken, because something told me Bob Wilson wasn't running from Karen. He was running from something bigger, and if we found him, we might finally uncover the real masterminds behind this entire operation. But the real question was, would we find him before they did? The final hunt. We had no time to waste. Karen was dead, Diane had vanished, and whoever was behind this, they were closing in. Our only lead, Bob Wilson, the former HOA treasurer, the man who had skipped town the moment things started falling apart. Dad spent the next few hours digging through records, searching for anything that might tell us where Bob had gone. And finally, he found it. A property record. Bob had recently purchased a cabin in the mountains, 2 hours away from the city. I exhaled. So that's where he ran. Dad nodded. And that's where we're going. The cabin in the woods. The drive felt tense. The whole way up, we kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting another black SUV to appear, but no one followed. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already setting behind the trees. The place looked abandoned. No cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows. Mom frowned. Are we too late? Dad shook his head. Only one way to find out. He stepped onto the porch and knocked. Silence. Then, a rustling sound. Dad tensed. Bob, it's Tom Reynolds. More silence. Then, the door unlocked. And Bob Wilson stood there, a shotgun in his hands. His face was pale, thin. He looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. His hands were shaking. You shouldn't be here, he whispered. Dad took a slow step forward. We need answers. Bob swallowed hard. It's too late. Then, he glanced over our shoulders, and his face drained of color. Run. The attack. Before we could react, gunshots rang out. Wood splintered as bullets tore through the porch. Dad yanked us inside, slamming the door shut. Get down. Bob dropped to the floor, reloading his shotgun with shaking hands. They found me, he rasped. I peeked through the blinds. At least 3 men in black tactical gear were moving through the trees. They weren't cops, they weren't with the HOA. These were professionals, and they were here to erase loose ends. Bob cursed under his breath. You have no idea what you've walked into. Dad grabbed his arm. Then tell us, now. Bob took a shuddering breath. Then, finally, he started talking. The truth. The HOA was never just an HOA, Bob said, voice trembling. It was a front. A way for these guys to launder money. Mom swallowed. We figured that out. Bob shook his head. Number, you don't get it. This isn't just some scam. His eyes flickered with fear. These guys, they run the whole city. They have cops, judges, politicians, even bankers on their payroll. They use HOA accounts to hide money, and anyone who asks too many questions. He swallowed. They disappear. I shivered. Like Karen. Bob nodded grimly. She thought she could blackmail them. She thought she had control. Dad's jaw tightened, but she was just another pawn. Bob exhaled. Exactly. A gunshot shattered the window. Bob jumped. We need to move, now. Dad nodded. Where's the back door? Bob pointed. Through the kitchen. Mom grabbed my hand, pulling me behind her as we moved. Outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. They were getting closer. We barely made it to the kitchen when we heard the front door explode inward. They were inside. Bob grabbed his shotgun. Go, I'll hold them off. Dad froze. Bob. Go, Bob hissed. Dad clenched his jaw. Then he pulled us through the back door, the last thing I saw before we disappeared into the woods. Bob standing his ground. And then, gunfire, the escape. We ran through the trees, branches whipping past our faces. Behind us, shouting, footsteps, more gunshots. Then, tires screeched. A car engine roared to life. I gasped as a black SUV burst through the woods, right in front of us. The driver's side window rolled down, a gun leveled at Dad's chest. I sucked in a breath. This was it. But before the trigger could be pulled, another gunshot. The driver's head snapped forward. Blood splattered across the windshield. I whipped around, standing there, gun in hand. Matt, the man Dad had called. His face was unreadable. "Get in." Dad didn't hesitate. He threw open the door, shoving me and Mom inside. Then Matt floored the gas. The SUV sped away from the cabin, leaving the gunman behind, leaving Bob behind, and we didn't look back. The aftermath. By the time we reached the city, it was over. The next morning, the news broke. HOA, corruption, scandal uncovered, multiple arrests made. The names of high-ranking officials were released. People resigned. Some were arrested. And as for the gunmen, no one ever found them. Bob Wilson, his body was never recovered, but deep down, I knew he was gone. 1 week later, we sold the house. There was nothing left for us there. The HOA collapsed overnight, and without Karen, or the criminals behind it, the neighborhood was finally free. Before we left, I stood outside, staring at the empty HOA office, remembering everything that had happened. Then Dad stepped beside me. He exhaled. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah?" Then I looked up at him. "What do you think happens next?" Dad smiled faintly. "I think we move on." And for the first time in a long time, I actually believed him. Homeowners associations were supposed to protect communities, but ours had been something else entirely, something dangerous. And in the end, Karen wasn't the real villain. She was just another pawn in a much bigger game. And now, that game was finally over. We had won, but it had come at a cost, and the lesson we learned? Sometimes the smallest injustices are hiding the biggest crimes.